Curious about how far people had to go to get food during World War II? Their definition of wealth was having food on the table. So people got creative with what they had in rather weird ways. Let's take a look at them. So braised beef tongue might be something you are not used to hearing, and the idea of beef tongue in general might be icky to some. Still, keep your minds open because the people back then definitely had to, and what they found out was that it is not so bad. Maybe you might be in for a culinary shakeup too? Either way, braised beef tongue was quite a popular dish that would typically be served in a casserole-like manner during World War II. Due to the war, it was very difficult for families to acquire the meats they were typically used to having, and beef tongue was rubbery and tough, but it was the best they could get. Braising it made for a softer bite and a lot of flavor, so you had all your protein and nutrition needs ticked off cheap and easy. That was a lot more than you could expect during wartime. Roosevelt Coffee was a beverage that people both created and drank much more out of necessity than commonly shared caffeine preferences or a newly acquired taste. People needed to make their coffee rations last as long as possible, and one trick they found out that greatly extended the duration of a batch was to reuse grounds. With the US already rationing coffee to a pound per household every 5 weeks, things were rough. The end product was a thin and watery drink that tasted close enough to a fresh cup while taking the real worries of spending more than they were able to on coffee off of people's shoulders. Honestly, it was not that bad either, and it was named Roosevelt Coffee in honor of the president if you wanted some historical trivia to spice the drink up further. If you ever find yourself not being able to get some fresh grounds, maybe try making a batch of this and see how you find it. You may be just as surprised as Americans back then with each sip. Eggless sponge cakes might be a concept that you cannot imagine or wrap your head around today, but back then a lot of people skipped the eggs entirely. What people used instead were margarine, sugar, and syrups to get the same vibe. What you got was a crowd entirely in favor of a sponge cake that was airy, fluffy, and made the best of your resources. Wartime brings out the frugality in everyone, but in this case it brought out the inner baker with a quick fix or workaround for everything. If you did not have ingredients or could not spare them, then you did not have to worry. You could still enjoy a yummy dessert with your family, and this is a testament to human creativity and how even the bleakest of situations can never kill your sweet tooth. By now, you must be getting an idea of how many basic things really slipped out of people's hands, including once common delicacies like sour cream. People found a good replacement that met them halfway for more or less the same experience in potato flour sour cream, which used potato flour and sugar to copy the essential taste of sour cream. It came pretty close too, if we do say so ourselves. You do not have to hear it from us though, just search this classic World War II recipe up and you will find many references dating back to this era about the recipe. This would later go on to inspire dishes like sour cream potato rolls in more stable times, and folks still kept the recipe in rotation. A more simple breakfast to get people's day started was creamed peas on toast. Look, lots of homes could only use so much butter, and spices like cinnamon or other toppings very popular with toast nowadays were definitely out of the question. People still need a good kick to get their Monday in motion, and these peas were not only a wonderful source of protein, but the cream on the toast made for a filling breakfast too. There was a massive emphasis in World War II on dishes that prioritized nutrition while keeping you full or as full as you could get. In America, every household was more than willing to compromise a bit on flavor, elegance, or presentation in exchange for more practical food that still tasted all right. Creamed peas on toast understood the assignment perfectly and fit the bill. It was rare to get protein from actual meat during that period, but that didn't stop people from fulfilling their cravings by dabbling in mock cuisine, such as the popular mock fish fillet. While this did not actually use fish, it imitated the texture and flavor with pints of milk brought to boil, ground rice, chopped onion, and leeks, with the end being a good stir in a properly beaten egg. What you had was an excellent mimicry that felt close enough to the real thing while being distinct and offering a new experience. Nowadays, this recipe is used in vegan communities, but its origins come from very anti-vegan places, and it would be a great substitute for actual fish and chips as well. Think of a crispy and tender potato cake that has the perfect crunch to it too. and you have yourself a potato flottie. Potatoes were an ingredient that the horrendous war had not taken away from people, along with other basic necessities like wheat. So dishes involving potatoes saw a huge increase in popularity, and some rather forgotten ones like potato flotties got a whole new chance at life. Originally, it is popularly believed that canal workers came up with this oldie but goldie dish when they would cook grated potatoes over fires until they were golden brown. Whether they did invent the dish or not, it definitely was a comfort food for masses everywhere, and we can easily see why too. Considered classic 40s junk food, we would love to try a good authentic potato flottie today. Bubble and Squeak was something that completely fit the situations most people would find themselves in during the war, because this dish is all about the leftovers. Usually, Sunday dinner's leftovers would be used in a bubble and Squeak to make sure nothing went to waste. Plus, people would definitely take that sentiment to heart when it came to holiday dinners where there were enough things left to constitute at least 2 or 3 meals the next day. Usually, this dish is made with potatoes and cabbage and is fried, so it goes properly and amazingly with some potato flotties or other items on the list. Maybe you can take a note from people's books the next time you think you have nothing to eat, but plenty of things still left in the fridge. If people can make an entire fake fish fillet and still be pretty satisfied with it, then other meaty wonders like liver definitely are not too far off the horizon, and chopped liver substitute would eventually prove that right. Something that became incredibly popular in the war-torn landscape of America because all it took was some onions, green lentils, walnuts, and salt and pepper. You had to make a paste out of it to get the texture of chopped liver down, and in terms of taste, this was a completely new experience, yet a significantly cheaper and easier one. It was much easier to get ingredients like these than good quality liver back then, and a lot of citizens stuck with this recipe even after the dust settled because they liked how healthy of an alternative it was. Mock cuisine in general really saw its heyday during the harsh times of rationing, especially with all the things that were famously eaten before times got so bad like brain. People wanted more of their favorites, even if they had to compromise in some way, and things like mock brains would become really popular as a result. Known for being quite heavy on the seasoning and being laced with fat, they incorporated basic spices like hickory smoke, paprika, and garlic. People would typically have it with a tomato sauce if they could spare the ingredients, and it definitely scratched that itch that lots of US meat lovers were having around the nation. So, for onions stuffed with grape nuts, you needed nothing that fancy, not even a lot of seasoning outside of your basic salt and pepper. All you needed was 1.5 cups of pork sausage meat, some melted fat, ketchup, and if you could spare some strips, then bacon. Of course, the key player, grape nuts, would come later when the onions would be chopped and diced mixed with the sausage and the other ingredients. This was then baked for around 40 minutes, and the outcome was a resounding yes from everyone at the dinner table. Dishes that were simple but incredibly effective at filling everyone and leaving them with a happy smile were the holy grail of the 40s and 50s. People that grew up during World War II will know that mixing sawdust with bread to fortify it so that your supply would last twice as long is not quite the urban myth it is made out to be today, but rather a sad fact of a dark time that people would prefer to leave in the past. This was something born purely out of necessity and a lack of basic necessities like flour. Since it was becoming so scarce across America, people's supplies of bread were running out fast and often. Bread was the only thing families had to eat too. With even that comfort gone, people took to mixing sawdust, which you could even taste in the bread. In some cases, it made the bread go bad faster, such as people when used too much of it. But in most other appliances of this technique, it worked as a filler when nothing else could be used as one. This would also set up a trend of consuming fiber in the 70s, even though most companies used cellulose fiber that was made from sawdust. So it actually does have quite a history in America. Cottage cheese being used as a substitute for meat is another factor of cooking that you probably never thought was possible, but is actually well documented. Even the Department of Agriculture agrees that it is a pretty rocking substitute for meat as it contains a lot of protein, and when you need to get your macros in on a budget, you cannot be complaining about the source. Sure, everyone would love to fulfill their battle-action protagonist fantasies of chowing down trays and trays of meat, but we only need so many grams of protein in a day to make a bulk. Dry curd cottage cheese especially contains more protein per pound than beef or lamb, and only chicken and veal beat it at that game. It seems there is a lot of cooking know-how that can be picked up from Americans living in those times. Ever thought you would have a cassie with no meat in it? An economy loaf is just that, and we could not have named it better if you put a gun to our head. Using potatoes, peas, flour, eggs, and some basic seasoning, this was a loaf made entirely of alternatives to meat, so for vegans it is a recipe to keep in mind throughout the ages. But in the rationing-ridden times of World War II, it was a godsend to have this quick and easy loaf. It was even popular enough to be in cookbooks like The Modern Hostess, even its special patriotic edition. Roosevelt's presidency really saw some gems, right? Shortages were extremely common right up to before Pearl Harbor and especially after it. This is what led to things like Woolton Pie dominating the mainstream, even though the dish would probably not see the light of day in normal circumstances. It is just that things like pies, loaves, pizzas, etc. had all become unattainable desires that were out of the public's grasp, more or less. Something had to be done, though, because not only did people need to be fed, they needed to be reminded of why eating good food is one of life's best joys. A hot, nice meal can do so much for a person's soul in times of conflict and uncertainty. And Woolton pies, despite being made entirely out of vegetables, not only gave your body the health boost it needed, but they felt comforting to share with your family. There is nothing like taking advantage of nature's bounty with sweet dishes like apple brown betties, and if the subject is how a pie can put you in the right mood, then it is criminal not to talk about these. Usually made with apples or pears, berries, and other seasonal common fruit, the fruit would be baked, and layers of sweetened crumbs would hold it all together. The dish was the textbook definition of comfort food, and it screamed grandma's cooking in a time where many people did not know if they would see their family again. Lots of folks were suffering from malnutrition and hunger, but pies like this, which are easy to make with natural ingredients, were a blessing. Apple brown betties are not as widely consumed today as they were during the World War, but back in the day, people found solace in the dessert they could make with whatever little they had. The recipe is commendable and might taste weird to us today because of our modern tastes. One of the highest causes of malnutrition and all the other issues that can come with it is a massive lack of fat, and wartime drippings were a great way to get around that big problem. Rations would often not last until the end of the week, and dinners would get bland, boring, and uninspired. So people started collecting bacon drippings and reusing them, adding them to potato-based dishes or loaves to make their dinners a bit yummier. It was not too hard to make, and it really let you use every aspect of a bacon strip, so we can see why people took to this so well. Black pudding used to be one of the most precious desserts of America that people would chow down on every Sunday. And despite those simple joys being out of reach, people wanted to try their hand at recreating the taste and thrill of a black pudding with what was there on hand. Thus we had mock black pudding. This typically involved porridge oats or oatmeal, with thyme as the primary seasoning. If you had butter, then even better, but margarine worked just fine to give it thickness. What you had was something that did not truly capture the taste of a good black pudding pie, but was still awfully delightful to eat. It makes sense why people would go back to the original when it became a reasonable idea, though. One of the easiest mixes available at the time was potatoes and sausages into what would be known today as potato piglets. Maybe the naming is pretty on the nose, but the taste was to die for. Sausages were still relatively cheaper than a lot of other options, so you would commonly see people replenish their stock at butcher's markets and meat stores. What was also equally as trendy was a good potato element in any dish, even in Woolton pies like we talked about earlier. So these piglets would incorporate potatoes into sausages to satisfy that void left in American hearts. And we have to say, they did a pretty fine job. Wartime drippings were not the only instance of people using a strip of bacon to its last drop, literally. Bacon fat itself would have a lot of uses even outside of cooking, for example, in arson and in making bombs. The U.S. Army would regularly request many neighborhoods and families to donate any extra bacon grease they could spare because it was key in making glycerin, which could be used to make gunpowder and bombs. The more you know about the world, the more it leaves you in awe how far human imagination can go. Bacon fat would be used again and again in different ways for cooking, but this is the first time we have heard of the kitchen coinciding with the battlefield. Potatoes really are the gift that keeps on giving, and in this case, they could also be used to make cheese. Bacon does not have a monopoly on being the only versatile food, it seems, as potato rarebits were a great display of how much you could really do with a potato. Grated cheese, toast, and mashed potato spreaded on hot toast was basically its own kind of sandwich that people could not get enough of. Something like this would pass even by today's standards, so we can only imagine how it drove the masses crazy back then. Now, if you had some vanilla essence to spare, mock maple syrup was the thing to go for, and it tasted virtually the same as the actual thing itself. No essence? No worries. All you really need is some brown sugar and boiled water to achieve the same effect. It was definitely a fast, easy, and delicious way to spice up your pancakes, helping you survive the week on those ever-shortening rations just a bit easier than before you had the syrup. Waffles were also a beloved combo for this maple syrup, and it makes a lot of sense since the real thing had become pretty hard to get by then. That's it for the wartime food being served in our country. If you learned something new today, give this video a like and subscribe.